Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer. We're tackling a massive frustration that, honestly, almost every single one of us has faced at some point. You know the drill, studying for hours on end, only to realize literally nothing actually stuck in your brain. Well, today we're opening up the Active Learner's Playbook. We're going to look at the exact science-backed methods that'll transform passive, downright exhausting studying into an active, highly effective process. We're talking about building solid, long-term memory. Seriously, why do you forget everything you just studied? We've all been there, right? You spend an entire evening just staring at a textbook, feeling pretty confident. But then, the next day, you sit down for the test and boom, your mind goes completely blank. So why does that happen? Well, the simple answer is that your brain is incredibly efficient at dumping passive information. If you're just letting words wash over you without forcing your brain to do any heavy lifting, your brain just assumes that information isn't important enough to keep. Now, most of us naturally default to a flawed, and let's be real, incredibly boring, baseline. Passive rereading. Repeatedly looking at your notes creates this sneaky illusion of competence. You recognize the words on the page, so you kind of trick yourself into thinking you know them. But the dynamic, science-backed solution here is active recall. This means actually putting the notes away and forcing yourself to pull that information directly out of your memory. Think of it like this. It's the difference between simply watching someone lift weights at the gym and actually picking up the dumbbells yourself. Section 1. The core memory formula. Think of your brain like a muscle. It really only strengthens its connections when it's forced to work hard to retrieve data. So first up is how you structure your time. Look, your brain just isn't built for those brutal 6-hour marathon study sessions. It remembers things so much better when you work in short, highly focused bursts. The absolute most popular method for this is the Pomodoro technique. Basically, you study intensely for 25 to 50 minutes, and then you completely step away. Take a 5 to 10 minute break. Then just repeat the cycle. This keeps your mind fresh and completely prevents that massive drop-off in focus that happens when you try to study for way too long. So what should you actually be doing during those focused 25 to 50 minute chunks? Well, instead of just passively reading, you need to use active recall methods. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Shut the book and try to explain the topic out loud to an empty room. Or write down everything you can remember on a blank piece of paper. Use flashcards. Try to solve questions without looking at the answer key. When you actually struggle to retrieve that info, you are literally paving the neural pathways that make memory permanent. To see how this all builds over time, we've got to look at the absolute magic of spaced repetition. You can't just learn something once and expect it to stick around forever. You have to review topics multiple times over several days to beat the forgetting curve. A fantastic pattern to follow goes like this. Day 1, you learn the new topic. Day 2, you do a quick review. Day 5, review it again. And by day 10, test yourself entirely from memory. By purposefully spacing out these reviews, you are permanently shifting that information from a short-term holding cell right into your long-term memory. Another totally foundational pillar here is the Feynman technique, named after the famous physicist Richard Feynman. The core concept is pretty brilliant. If you can explain something simply to someone else, you truly understand it. Complex jargon, that usually just hides a lack of understanding. So pretend you're a teacher. Try explaining the concepts to a friend, or honestly, even just to yourself, using the simplest words possible. If you stumble or can't explain it simply, you have instantly identified the exact gap in your knowledge that you need to go back and review. Section 2, brain hacks that work. Okay, now that we have the core foundations totally locked in, let's drop some actionable cognitive tricks right into your daily toolkit. These will make complex information incredibly sticky. First up, mnemonics. A classic example is using PEMDAS in math to remember the order of operations. Super simple, right? Next is visualization. Don't just memorize abstract, boring facts. Imagine the concepts as vivid pictures or ridiculous stories in your head. Seriously, the weirder, the better. And finally, chunking. When you're staring down a massive wall of information, break it down into small, logical groups. It's exactly why we format phone numbers with dashes. It makes large chunks of data so much easier for the human brain to grab onto. Building on that, our brains are literally hardwired to remember connected ideas way better than isolated random facts. So link historical events to a narrative story, or connect abstract science concepts to things you actually see in your daily life. Group similar ideas together, and while you do that, get multiple senses involved. The more ways you interact with the information, whether that's combining reading, writing, speaking out loud,
drawing out diagrams or watching educational explainers, the stronger that memory becomes. You're basically giving your brain a bunch of different roads to find the exact same piece of information. Which leads us perfectly into smart note-taking. Listen, the absolute worst thing you can do is just copy everything the teacher says or the textbook writes, word for word. That is totally passive. Instead, use bullet points, create mind maps, write down only the keywords, and use color coding for the really important ideas. Why does this matter? Well, because using a keyword or assigning a specific color forces your brain to stop and ask, wait, is this actually important? It completely stops you from blindly transcribing and forces you to actively filter and synthesize the info.
Section 3. The perfect study hour.
So we've got all these individual tactics: active recall, spaced repetition, smart notes. But how do they logically combine into a single cohesive session when you sit down at your desk? Well, it becomes the journey of a single fact from introduction to total mastery. Step 1, learn the material. Step 2, recall it without looking. Step 3, review what you missed. Step 4, practice using the information. And finally, Step 5, teach it to someone else. I promise you, this sequence works exponentially better than just reading your notes on repeat. Now, what's really interesting about this is we can actually map that exact formula onto a single 60-minute hour. Let's break it down exactly. Spend your first 10 minutes reading and understanding the concept. Then spend the next 20 minutes practicing or making those smart keyword-based notes we talked about. Next, spend 15 minutes testing yourself completely blindly, no peeking. Dedicate 5 minutes to reviewing the mistakes you just made during your test. And finally, spend the last 10 minutes doing a quick recap of everything. Bam! That is a highly actionable, perfectly balanced study hour you can use right now. Of course, how you actually practice during that hour is going to look completely different depending on the subject. If you're studying math, you need to physically solve problems. For languages, you've got to speak and write daily. In science, practice by drawing out the diagrams and mapping the concepts. And for computer subjects, well, you have to get your hands on the keyboard and do the actual coding practice. Memory only becomes strong through active contextual use. You just cannot learn to code by simply reading a book about it.
Section 4. Protecting your progress.
So, you've done the work. You've studied actively. But to actually lock in all that hard work, we really have to look at lifestyle factors outside of your study hour. First and foremost, you absolutely must sleep properly. Sleep is incredibly important for memory. It's literally the time when your brain physically cements the memories you built during the day. Students who get a good night's sleep routinely remember way more than students who pull all-nighters. You should be aiming for 7 to 9 hours a night. Oh, and here's a massive pro tip. Review your most difficult topics right before you go to sleep. It lets your brain process all that complex data overnight.
Secondly, you have got to remove distractions. Multitasking, it's a total myth. Your brain simply remembers less when its attention is divided. When it's time to study, put the phone completely out of sight. Turn off all those unnecessary tabs on your browser. Find a genuinely quiet place to work. Because if you're constantly shifting your focus back and forth between a textbook and your social media feed, you're actively killing your memory retention. No joke. So the crucial point is this: do not try to memorize everything immediately. Rote memorization without any context is super brittle. Your primary focus must always be on understanding the concept first. Only after you really understand how the pieces fit together should you begin practicing recalling it. And do that repeatedly over time using spaced repetition and active recall. That sequence, understand it first, then recall it, is exactly how bulletproof long-term memory is built. Which leaves us with one final thought. You now have the full playbook. You know that simply staring at your notes is a total waste of your time, and you know exactly how to test yourself, space out your reviews, and teach concepts to build real mastery. The tools are literally right there in front of you. So the only question left to answer for your next study session is, are you ready to stop reading and start remembering?